Flour doesn't wash out. It cakes in the creases of your knuckles, turns to paste in your sweat, and smells like an open grave when it sours. Corin knew this better than anyone, scrubbing the wooden dough trough until her nails split, bleeding quietly into the yeast. Heat radiated from the brick oven in blistering waves, a relentless physical weight that pressed against Corin's chest long before the sun even bothered to crest the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range. Dawn was a concept she only experienced through the changing temperature of the bakery's back room. She stood at the massive oak table, her hands buried wrist-deep in a gray-white mound of dough. Push, fold, lean. The rhythm was born of survival, not passion. Her shoulders screamed with a dull, familiar ache, a permanent resident in her joints since she was 12. Oakfield was a town that chewed people up and spit them out as dust. Outside the frosted windows, the boardwalks groaned under the boots of miners and loggers, men who smelled of sulfur and desperation. Inside, the air was thick, choked with airborne flour that settled on Corin's eyelashes and turned her dark hair a premature, dull gray. "You're working it too slow." The voice crashed through the heavy air, followed by the heavy, dragging footsteps of Horace, her father. He emerged from the narrow hallway leading to his sleeping quarters, scratching his chest through a stained thermal shirt. The smell of last night's rot-gut whiskey rolled off him, mingling sickeningly with the sweet scent of baking yeast. "It's stiff this morning," Corin said, her voice gravelly, keeping her eyes pinned to the table. The draft from the window. The dough seized up. Horace didn't care about drafts. He cared about the copper coins dropped on the front counter. He crossed the room, his shadow falling over her workstation. Without a word of warning, his thick, calloused hand lashed out, clipping the back of her head. It wasn't a closed fist, he saved those for when the doors were locked, but it was enough to knock her forward. Her chin struck the edge of the flour bin. A sharp bite of pain flared in her jaw. "Don't give me weather reports, girl. Give me bread." Corin didn't cry. Tears were water, and water messed up the hydration of the dough. She just swallowed the metallic taste of blood pooling against her bottom teeth, righted herself, and pushed harder into the sticky mass. Fold, lean, turn. By noon, the bakery was a stifling cage. The front bell chimed incessantly. Corin moved like an automaton, wrapping loaves in brown paper, taking sweaty coins from the unwashed hands of transient men. She rarely looked at their faces. They were just coats and hands. Then, the bell didn't so much chime as it was violently shoved aside. The door opened, letting in a savage blast of December wind that swept the loose flour off the counter into a swirling vortex. Corin shivered, looking up. He filled the doorway. He didn't wear the canvas dusters or the woolen coats of the townsfolk. He wore the mountains. Thick, raw hides, scraped leather hardened by bear grease. He had a heavy, dark beard, but it wasn't the unkempt tangle of a drunkard. It was trimmed close to the jawline, pragmatic. His eyes, catching the dim light of the lantern above the register, were the color of slate. Hard, unreadable. He stepped inside, and the floorboards, which usually shrieked under Horace's weight, barely registered his presence. He moved with a terrifying, liquid silence. The overwhelming stench of stale beer and sweat in the shop was instantly cut by the sharp, piercing odor of pine resin, wood smoke, and wet earth. He stopped at the counter. He didn't browse. He pointed a thick finger, missing half the nail, at the dense rounds of hardtack and rye behind the glass. 6 of the rye, 10 pounds of the tack. His voice was a low rumble, feeling more like a vibration in Corin's boots than sound in her ears. Corin scrambled to grab the heavy sacks. She hauled the hardtack onto the counter. "That'll be $3.40, she said, her voice shaking slightly, furious at herself for the weakness. The man reached into a deep leather pouch at his belt. As he did, Horace emerged from the back, wiping his greasy hands on his apron. He took one look at the mountain man and his eyes narrowed, calculating. "Make it $4, Horace said smoothly, stepping up to the counter and pushing Corin aside with his hip. "Winter premium, rise hard to get." Corin froze. It was a lie. The mountain man paused. He didn't look at Horace. He kept his slate eyes fixed on Corin, seeing the way her shoulders hitched, the way she subtly shrank away from her father's proximity. He saw the fresh red welt forming along her jawline where she'd hit the bin. The silence stretched, thick and dangerous. The mountain man didn't argue. He didn't pull a knife. He simply pulled 4 silver dollars from his pouch, setting them down on the wood with a heavy, definitive clack. "Keep it dry," he said, addressing Corin directly, completely ignoring Horace. He took his sacks and turned. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the bakery feeling suffocatingly small again. Corin stared at the frosted glass, watching his dark shape dissolve into the snow flurry. "Stupid savage," Horace muttered, scooping the silver into his pocket. "Get back to the ovens, girl. That dough ain't gonna bake itself." Bruises blossomed on Corin like dark flowers in winter. 2 days after the mountain man came to town, the real cold snapped. The kind of cold that froze the water in the wash basin overnight and made the iron hinges of the oven doors burn cold against the skin. It also brought bad luck. Horace had spent the previous evening at the Silver Dollar Saloon. He returned hours before dawn, stumbling through the back door, smelling of vomit and cheap perfume. Corin was already up, sifting flour. She knew the look in his bloodshot eyes. It was panic. He slumped heavily into a wooden chair, running a trembling hand over his face. "Briggs called the marker," he rasped, staring at the floor. Corin stopped sifting. The wooden sieve went still in her flour-caked hands. Briggs owned the Silver Dollar. He also owned half the men in Oakfield through predatory loans and rigged card tables. He was a vile, sweating man who looked at Corin with eyes that made her skin crawl. "How much?" she asked, her voice hollow. 400. Horace looked up, and for a second, she thought she saw regret. It vanished, replaced by the cornered rat viciousness she knew all too well. "I don't have it. The flour supplier cut me off yesterday. We're broke, Corin. I can bake more. We can extend the hours." "It ain't enough!" Horace slammed his fist on the table, a cloud of white dust exploding upward. "He wants it by Friday, or he takes the shop." He paused, his breathing ragged. He said he'd take the debt out and trade. "He runs girls upstairs at the saloon. He said you could work it off." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire in the oven crackled, a mocking, cheerful sound against the crushing weight of the words. Corin didn't scream. She didn't cry. A strange glacial numbness washed over her. She looked at her father, this pathetic, sweaty lump of a man who had worked her to the bone her entire life, and realized he had already agreed to it. He was just figuring out how to tell her. "I'm going to draw water," Corin said softly. She set the sieve down. She walked past him, ignoring his stammering excuses, pulled her thin woolen shawl over her shoulders, and stepped out the back door into the freezing alleyway. The cold hit her like a physical blow. She walked to the communal pump, her boots breaking the icy crust of the mud. She grabbed the iron handle, pumping it violently. Squeak, groan, splash. The water hit the wooden bucket, freezing almost instantly at the edges. She kept pumping until the bucket overflowed, the freezing water splashing onto her skirts, soaking through to her shins. She didn't care. The physical pain of the freezing water was grounding. She leaned her forehead against the rusted iron of the pump, her breath pluming in white clouds. She couldn't run. She had no money, no horse, no winter gear. If she walked into the woods, she'd freeze to death in a night. If she stayed, she belonged to Briggs. A sharp scrape of metal against leather broke her spiral. Corin turned her head. 30 yards away, next to the general store's livery, the mountain man was cinching a saddle onto a massive, scarred mule. He was packing up, leaving. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He didn't offer a polite nod. He just stared, assessing. Corin wiped her nose with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of wet flour across her cheek. She picked up the heavy bucket, the wire handle biting into her raw palms, and began to walk back. She meant to ignore him. She meant to keep her head down. But as she passed the livery fence, her boot caught on a frozen rut. She stumbled hard, spilling half the freezing water down her own leg. A ragged, ugly sob tore from her throat before she could stop it. It was just one sound, but it betrayed everything. She scrambled to pick up the bucket, her fingers numb and clumsy. When she looked up, He was standing over her. He didn't offer his hand. He just looked down at the soaked hem of her dress, then at the bruised line of her jaw, and finally into her eyes. "You look like a cornered animal," he said. His voice wasn't cruel. It was merely observational, a statement of fact. "And you smell like a dead one," Corin fired back, the anger bubbling up sudden and hot. She was so tired of men standing over her. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch occurred at the corner of his mouth. It might have been amusement. "Malachi," he said. "I didn't ask your name. I'm giving it anyway." Malachi hooked his thumbs into his heavy leather belt. He looked toward the back door of the bakery, where Horace's shadow occasionally blotted out the light. "He hit you again?" "It's none of your business." "No," Malachi agreed, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "It isn't." He looked back at his mule. "I got a claim up on Blackwood Ridge. 2 days' ride. Snow's coming in thick by the end of the week. I run a 50-mile trap line. Means I'm gone for a week, sometimes 10 days at a time." Corin gripped the bucket handle, her teeth beginning to chatter. "Why are you telling me this?" Malachi turned his slate eyes back to her. There was no warmth in them, but there was no malice either. There was only a terrifying, stark honesty. "Because fire goes out when it ain't fed. The cabin freezes, pipes burst. I need a firekeeper." He paused, looking her up and down. "And the territorial government just passed the new Homestead Act. A married man gets a double acreage patent. I need the timber rights." Corin stared at him, the cold forgotten for a single stunned second. You're asking for a wife? Like I'm a piece of livestock?" "I'm offering a transaction," Malachi corrected, his voice flat. "You stay here. That man inside sells you to cover a bad hand of cards. I saw Briggs talking to him at the saloon. It's the way the wind is blowing. You come with me, you keep the hearth warm, you sign a paper at the land office." He took a step closer. He was a giant of a man, blocking out the pale winter sun. "I don't drink. I don't raise my hand to women. I won't touch you unless you tell me to. And you'll have food that ain't made of dust." Corin swallowed hard. The wind howled through the alley, biting at her wet skirts. She looked at the bakery door. The thought of the heat inside made her nauseous. The thought of Briggs's wet lips made her want to die. She looked at Malachi. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a knight. He was a harsh, feral thing born of the mountains, seeking an arrangement of convenience. He didn't love her. He barely knew her. "I don't know anything about the woods," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't ask if you could track a elk," Malachi said. "I asked if you could put wood in a stove." Corin looked down at her hands, chapped, blistered, caked in flour. She was a baker's daughter. Her life was measured in cups of yeast and ounces of silver. She looked back up, her jaw set, her eyes hard. "What's the price?" Horace didn't put up a fight. He put up a price tag. When Corin walked back into the bakery with Malachi filling the doorframe behind her, the smell of yeast was instantly overpowered by the scent of the wild. Horace turned from the ovens, a wooden paddle in his hands, his face flushing red with indignation that quickly melted into profound, coward's terror when he saw the size of the man standing behind his daughter. "What is this?" Horace demanded, though his voice lacked its usual thunder. "I'm leaving," Corin said. Her voice didn't shake. It surprised her. She untied the stained, heavy canvas apron from her waist and let it drop to the flour-covered floor. It hit with a dull thud, raising a small cloud of white dust. A surrender flag in the dirt. "The hell you are!" Horace barked, taking a half-step forward. "You belong here. You have debts to pay." Malachi stepped around Corin. He didn't draw the heavy revolver strapped to his thigh, nor did he unshoulder his rifle. He simply walked to the counter, reached into his heavy coat, and pulled out a leather pouch. He untied the rawhide string and upended it over the glass display case. 5 solid chunks of raw, unrefined gold hit the glass. They were heavy, misshapen, and dull, but their weight made the glass creak. "That's 1.5 ounces," Malachi stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that brooked no argument. puts her debt to you and your debt to the saloon to rest. If Briggs asks, you tell him her accounts are closed." Horace stared at the gold. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands twitched. Greed warred with the loss of his free labor, but the gold, it was right there. Tangible. He reached out, his greasy fingers snatching the nuggets off the glass like a starving dog snapping up meat. "Pack your things," Malachi said, looking down at Corin. He didn't ask, he instructed. Corin didn't look at her father as she walked down the narrow hallway to her closet-sized room. She had nothing. 2 faded dresses, a heavy wool sweater moth-eaten at the elbows, a worn pair of boots, and a tortoiseshell comb that had belonged to her mother. She rolled them into a canvas sack, her hands moving with frantic, mechanical speed. She felt detached, hovering somewhere above her own body. She had just been bought, traded like a sack of premium winter rye. When she emerged, Horace was already gone, likely running to the saloon to clear his marker. The bakery was empty. The fire in the oven still roared, uncared for. Malachi took her canvas sack without a word and tied it behind the saddle of his buckskin horse. "The magistrate is 2 streets over," he said. The walk was agonizingly slow. The cold bit through Corin's damp skirts. The townsfolk they passed stared, whispering behind gloved hands, the flour-dusted girl and the beast from the hills. Corin kept her chin high, though her insides were twisting into violent knots. She was terrified. She was walking away from the devil she knew into the wilderness with a man whose hands were large enough to snap her neck without straining. The justice of the peace occupied a cramped office above the feed store. It smelled of cheap cigar smoke, old paper, and mice. Magistrate Higgins, a balding man with ink-stained fingers, looked them over with bored, bloodshot eyes. He didn't ask questions. In Oakfield, questions got you shot. "Names?" Higgins asked, dipping a steel nib pen into an inkwell. "Malachi Cross," the mountain man said. "Corin Miller," she whispered. She realized with a jolt it was the last time she would say that name. The ceremony, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 minutes. There were no rings. There were no vows of love or cherishing. Higgins muttered a few legal phrases, asked if they were here of their own free will. "I am," Malachi said. Corin hesitated. She looked at the dirty window pane, at the gray sky, promising a brutal snowstorm. "I am," she lied. She was here of necessity. "Sign here." Higgins pushed a heavy ledger across the desk. Malachi scratched his name with a heavy, blocky hand. Corin took the pen. Her hand shook. A drop of black ink fell onto the thick parchment, bleeding outward like a dark bruise. She signed her name over it. Corin Cross. It looked foreign. It looked like a forgery. Malachi paid the magistrate a silver dollar. "We ride out now," he said to her. Downstairs, the wind had picked up. Malachi hoisted her onto the broad back of the pack mule, settling her behind a massive pile of canvas-wrapped supplies. He didn't offer to share his horse. He mounted his buckskin, taking the mule's lead rope. "Hold on to the ropes. Don't lean back. The trail gets steep fast," he commanded. He spurred his horse forward. The mule jerked, following. Corin grabbed the coarse hemp ropes, tying the packs down, her knuckles instantly turning white in the cold. As they rode out of Oakfield, the sounds of the town, the clatter of the mill, the shouts from the saloon, the ever-present chime of the bakery bell began to fade. They were replaced by the profound, terrifying silence of the tree line. The massive pines swallowed them up, their branches heavy with snow, blocking out what little light remained of the afternoon. The cold was sharper here, cleaner, biting straight to the bone. Corin stared at the broad expanse of Malachi's back, encased in bear hide, swaying slightly with the horse's gait. She smelled the raw animal hide, the sharp pine, the absolute absence of yeast and sugar. She had escaped the oven, but as the dark woods closed in around her, she wondered if she had just stepped into the fire. Snow began to fall an hour past the tree line. It didn't drift down in gentle, picturesque flakes. It drove sideways, hard and particulate, stinging Corin's exposed cheeks like thrown sand. The trail wasn't a trail. It was a suggestion of a path, carved out by elk and erosion, winding perilously upward through dense stands of lodgepole pine and jagged granite outcroppings. The mule swayed with a sickening rhythmic lurch. Corin clung to the frozen hemp ropes, tying down the canvas packs until her fingers lost all feeling. Her thighs, unaccustomed to riding, screamed with a deep, tearing ache that radiated into her lower back. Malachi did not look back. He rode point, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the wind. He navigated the treacherous incline with a terrifying, thoughtless instinct, guiding his buckskin around ice-slicked roots and hidden sinkholes. Silence here wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was the creak of saddle leather, the sharp snap of frozen branches breaking under hooves, the ragged, wet breathing of the animals. In Oakfield, silence only meant Horace was sleeping off a binge. Here, silence meant the mountain was deciding whether to kill you. By dusk, the cold had moved past pain and settled into a dangerous, sluggish apathy. Corin's chin rested against her chest. Her eyelashes were frozen together. She was vaguely aware that if she slipped off the mule, she wouldn't have the strength to stand up. She might just go to sleep in the snow. It seemed like a quiet way to die. The animals stopped. Corin blinked, forcing her eyes open against the icy crust. Through the swirling whiteout, a dark shape materialized against the side of a massive limestone cliff. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress built of rough-hewn timber and thick mud chinking, hunkered down into the earth as if bracing for an impact. There was no welcoming porch, no glass in the single, heavily shuttered window. The roof was pitch steep to shed snow, covered in thick cedar shakes. Malachi dismounted. His boots hit the snow with a heavy crunch. He walked back to the mule, reached up, and gripped Corin by the waist. He lifted her down. Her legs gave out the second her boots hit the ground. She collapsed against his side, her frozen skirts tangling around her ankles. Malachi caught her by the collar of her thin coat, hauling her upright with effortless, brutal strength. "Walk," he grunted, shoving her toward the heavy timber door. "Blood needs to move. Walk." He didn't carry her. He pushed her forward. Corin stumbled, her knees locking, gasping at the biting air. She reached the door and leaned against the rough wood, shivering so violently her teeth clacked together. Malachi stepped past her, pulling a heavy iron key from his belt. The lock groaned, stiff with ice. He shoved the door inward with his shoulder. The air inside was colder than the air outside. It had been trapped in the dark, settling into a deep, stale freeze. The cabin smelled of old wood smoke, cured leather, in the sharp musk of animal traps. It was a single dim room. A cast-iron wood stove sat in the center, a rusted black monolith. Against one wall, a bed frame built of stripped pine poles held a mattress stuffed with dried grass and topped with thick, coarse furs. "Go to the stove," Malachi ordered, turning back out into the blizzard to untie the packs. "Iron box on the right. Matches and tinder. Start it." He pulled the door shut behind him, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. Panic, sudden and suffocating, flared in Corin's chest. She was blind. She was freezing. She fumbled forward, her hands outstretched, barking her shin against a heavy wooden chair. She bit down on a cry, dropping to her knees and crawling toward the center of the room until her raw hands hit the freezing iron of the stove. She felt around the floorboards. Her trembling fingers brushed a small metal tin. She pried it open, feeling the rough heads of sulfur matches and a bundle of dry bark. She opened the heavy iron door of the stove. It shrieked on its hinges. She reached inside, feeling the charred remnants of the last fire. "Start it." She struck a match against the iron. Her hands were shaking too badly. The match snapped in half. She struck another. It flared, blinding her for a second, then hissed out in the damp draft blowing down the stovepipe. Tears of sheer frustration pricked her eyes, freezing on her cheeks. Horace's voice echoed in her head. "Useless. Can't do a simple thing. Good for nothing but bleeding me dry." She expected the door to fly open. She expected a heavy hand to strike the back of her head, knocking her into the iron. She struck a third match. It lit. She touched it to the dry bark. The bark caught, a tiny, fragile yellow flame. She fed it a handful of pine needles, then a small stick of kindling. Present smoke billowed outward, stinging her eyes, but she didn't cough. She hovered over it, shielding it with her body, feeding it piece by agonizing piece. The door opened. The wind howled into the room, nearly sucking the tiny flame up the flue. Malachi entered, carrying 2 massive sacks of supplies. He kicked the door shut. The wind was cut off. Corin flinched, shrinking away from the stove, bracing for the blow. She had taken too long. The fire was too small. Malachi dropped the sacks on the floor. He walked over to the stove. He didn't look at her cowering form. He looked at the fire. He reached into a wooden bin beside the stove, pulled out 2 thick split logs of seasoned oak, and laid them carefully over the kindling. He adjusted the iron damper on the pipe. The fire, given oxygen and fuel, roared to life, casting dancing orange shadows across the rough log walls. "You smother it when you crowd the kindling," he said, his voice flat. He turned to her. He saw the way her arms were raised, shielding her head. He saw the terror in her posture. His jaw tightened. A muscle leaped in his cheek. He didn't offer a gentle reassurance. He didn't tell her she was safe. He simply stated a fact. "I told you I don't raise my hand. I don't waste energy on things that don't yield a return. Beating a dog just makes it bite. Beating a woman just makes her useless." He turned away, walking to the table to unbuckle his heavy leather coat. "Take your wet boots off. Put them near the iron, not on it, or the leather will crack." Corin lowered her arms. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched his broad back as he lit a kerosene lantern, washing the small room in a yellow, unforgiving light. There was no warmth in his words, but there was a stark, undeniable logic. It was a transaction. She was an investment. You don't break your own tools. Slowly, her hands aching, she began to unlace her frozen boots. The heat from the iron stove began to push back the freezing air. It smelled like burning dust and pine sap. It wasn't home, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for the next blow to fall. The blizzard did not break. It held the cabin hostage for 4 solid days. Time warped into a blur of gray light, filtering through the shutter slats and the relentless, concussive boom of the wind against the mud chinking. Cabin fever wasn't a metaphor. It was a physical pressure behind Corin's eyes. The 12 by 14 room shrank with every passing hour, entirely consumed by Malachi's sheer mass. He didn't pace. He sat by the stove, meticulous and silent, running an oiled rag over the barrel of his Winchester, or sharpening a skinning knife, until the scrape of steel on stone set Corin's teeth on edge. They existed in a brittle choreography. Words were rationed like the dried beans. Move, hot, draft. She learned the geography of the floorboards, avoiding the ones that shrieked. He slept on a wool blanket near the iron belly of the stove. She slept under the suffocating weight of bear furs that smelled of musk and old dust. On the 3rd afternoon, the silence snapped. Malachi dragged a frozen white-tailed deer carcass from a cache box just outside the door. He hauled it onto a stained canvas tarp in the center of the room. The sudden shift in temperature caused the meat to thaw rapidly, filling the stifling air with the sharp, metallic stench of copper and raw biology. It was wet and heavy. It made the bile rise tight in Corin's throat. She sat on the edge of the pole bed, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She watched, unable to look away, as Malachi drove the blade into the animal's belly. The sound was atrocious, a thick, wet tearing of membrane and muscle. "You're breathing shallow," Malachi stated. He didn't look up. His forearms were slick with dark red. Corin flinched. "I'm breathing fine." "You're holding it in because it stinks." He made another long, ruthless cut down the hind leg. "You want to eat tomorrow? You wear boots? Don't act delicate about the toll it takes." "I'm not delicate," she snapped. Her voice sounded thin, defensive. The memory of Horace's heavy hands, the crushing heat of the bakery ovens. She had survived a different kind of slaughterhouse. Malachi paused. He wiped a bloodied hand on his canvas thigh. turning his slate eyes on her. Then prove it, or sit there and wait to be fed like a house cat. The anger was sudden, hot, and welcome. It cut through the lethargy of the cold. Corin dropped her legs over the side of the bed. Her boots hit the floorboards with a deliberate thud. She walked to the edge of the tarp. Up close, the smell was a physical wall. "What do I do?" she demanded. Malachi pointed a red finger toward a wooden pail. "Grab the rock salt. When I strip the hide back, you pack it into the flesh side. Grind it in. If you miss a spot, it rots, and the work is wasted." Corin dropped to her knees on the canvas. The dampness immediately soaked through her wool skirt. She plunged her bare hands into the coarse salt. Malachi grabbed a fistful of hide, his shoulders bunching, and ripped it backward. The sound was a horrific, sucking pop. He exposed a raw, wet landscape of pink and red. She didn't hesitate. She slammed her hands down, grinding the harsh crystals into the wet tissue. The salt instantly found the raw, unhealed blisters on her palms, souvenirs from the hemp ropes on the mule ride. Searing, white-hot pain shot up her forearms. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted her own blood. But she didn't stop. She pushed. She rubbed. She matched the brutal, violent rhythm of his knife with the abrasive scrub of the salt. 2 hours later, they were done. Corin's hands were stained a muddy, rust brown, crusted with white flakes. Her lower back screamed. She stood up, mechanically wiping a stray hair from her forehead with her forearm, leaving a smear of deer blood across her pale skin. Malachi hoisted the heavy, salted hide over a ceiling beam. He poured a splash of precious melted snow into the iron wash basin and tossed her a block of lye soap. "You didn't quit," he noted, scrubbing his own hands. "I'm used to dirty work," Corin muttered, plunging her burning hands into the pink water. The next morning, the wind died. The silence was absolute, heavier than the storm. The sun broke through, reflecting off 3 feet of fresh powder with blinding intensity. Malachi left at dawn to dig out the woodpile and check the animals. Left alone, the cabin felt hollow. Corin wandered to the rough timber cupboards above the prep table. Behind a tin of rendered fat and a sack of dried chicory, she found it, a heavy clay crock. She lifted the wooden lid. Inside sat a mass of gray, dormant paste, sourdough starter. It smelled sour, neglected, desperate for fuel. A jolt of adrenaline, pure and instinctual, hit her blood. She didn't ask permission. She scooped warm water from the stove kettle into the crock. She hauled out a canvas sack of unbleached flour, dumping a generous mound onto the rough pine table. She plunged her raw, blistered hands into the sticky mass. The muscle memory was instantaneous. Squeeze, fold, hydrate, push. She worked the dough until it fought back, until the vinegary stench of neglect transformed into the sweet, potent aroma of living yeast. She didn't have her father's brick ovens. She had a cast iron skillet and a wood stove. She greased the iron with bear fat, dropped the heavy, pale round inside, and covered it with an inverted tin plate. By noon, the cabin no longer smelled of blood or musk. It smelled like caramelized sugar, toasted grain, and survival. The heavy door shrieked open. Malachi stepped inside, his arms loaded with split oak. He kicked the door shut, knocking the snow from his boots. He froze. His nostrils flared, taking in the heavy, intoxicating scent. He dropped the wood into the bin with a loud clatter. He walked slowly toward the stove, using a leather pad to lift the hot tin plate. Steam rolled upward. The loaf was a dark, crusty mahogany. Corin stood perfectly still by the table, her hands dusted in chalky white, her heart hammered against her ribs. She braced herself for anger she had used his stores without asking. Malachi didn't yell. He drew his hunting knife, wiped it cleanly on his trousers, and sawed a thick, steaming wedge from the round. He held it in his massive hand, watching the steam rise. Then he took a bite. Corin held her breath. He chewed slowly. His jaw worked, his eyes dropping to the floorboards. He swallowed, then looked up at her. The feral, guarded tension in his face had vanished, replaced by a stark, profound exhaustion. "Best thing I've put in my mouth in 5 years," he said. The words were low, carrying the weight of a confession. He didn't thank her. He didn't offer a hollow compliment. It was a factual, devastating validation. Corin walked to the stove, took the knife, and cut a piece for herself. The crust cracked perfectly. The crumb was dense, sour, and rich. Malachi watched her eat. "The trap line needs checking tomorrow," he said, his voice flat but steady. "Snow's deep. I'll be gone 3 days. I need someone to keep the iron hot." "I can do that," Corin said. "Good." She looked down at her hands. The flour was packed under her fingernails, mixing with the faint, rusty remnants of deer blood. They were scarred, rough, and aching, but as the heat of the stove washed over her, she realized they were finally her own. If Corin and Malachi's gritty fight for survival in the brutal frontier struck a chord, hit that like button to let us know. The Wild West wasn't built on fairy tales. It was forged in fire, snow, and stubborn grit. Share this video with fellow fans of raw, grounded romance dramas, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next gripping story. Saddle up, leave a comment below, and join our Frontier family.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, the baker's daughter needed escape from her father, the mountain man offered his name and protection. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the feeling of safety and trust. Stories like this remind us how important it is to have someone who is willing to stand by us during difficult times. Whether it's a friend, a family member, or someone unexpected, support can make a challenging situation feel a little less overwhelming. Do you think people are more likely to find strength on their own or through the help of others? And has there ever been a time when someone offered you support when you needed it most? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. One lesson I take from this story is that we can all make a difference by being dependable and looking out for the people around us. Sometimes, simply listening, offering encouragement, or showing kindness can mean more than we know. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe for more.